The mountain wind howled through the pines like the voices of the damned, its icy fingers clawing at Susan Rogers as she pressed her back against the rough, unyielding bark of an ancient oak. Her breath came in sharp, desperate gasps that formed small clouds in the frigid air, each exhalation a visible reminder of how close death lurked in these unforgiving peaks. Blood seeped steadily through the makeshift bandages around her legs, dark crimson stains spreading across the torn and filthy fabric of what had once been a respectable schoolteacher's dress. The men were close now, so close she could hear their individual voices carrying on the bitter mountain air, crude laughter mixing with threats and promises that made her stomach churn with a terror so profound it threatened to overwhelm her fragile sanity. "I can't walk, sir. My legs are broken," she had told the mountain man just hours before, when he'd found her crumpled like a discarded doll at the bottom of the treacherous ravine. The memory of his response echoed in her mind now, as she heard his heavy, measured footsteps approaching through the dense underbrush, each step deliberate and sure despite the darkness that shrouded the forest. "Then I'll carry you daily," he had said, those simple words spoken with such quiet conviction, such unwavering determination, that they had somehow managed to pierce through the thick veil of despair that had settled over her soul like a burial shroud. Now, as the sound of pursuing horses grew closer, and the baying of tracking dogs echoed off the canyon walls, Susan wondered with growing desperation if Jason Thompson would truly keep that promise. The mountain man had already risked everything to help her escape from the mining camp, where she'd been held against her will for 3 long, nightmarish months. Her legs, shattered in multiple places during her desperate attempt to flee down the rocky slope, throbbed with each heartbeat like drums of agony. But the physical pain paled in comparison to the soul-deep fear that gripped her with iron claws. The story of how Susan Rogers had come to be broken and bleeding in the Colorado wilderness began 6 months earlier, in the bustling, civilized streets of Denver. She had been a school teacher then, fresh from the cultured East with dreams of bringing education and enlightenment to the raw frontier. Her small frame and gentle manner had made her seem fragile to most who met her, like a delicate flower transplanted to harsh soil. But Susan possessed a quiet strength that had carried her through the devastating loss of both parents to influenza in the long, arduous journey west across a continent that seemed determined to test her resolve at every turn. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story of courage and unexpected love deserves to be shared far and wide. The trouble had started when she'd accepted a position at a remote mining settlement called Copper Creek, nestled high in the Rocky Mountains like an eagle's nest perched on the edge of nowhere. The job had promised good pay and the chance to make a real difference in the lives of children who had never seen the inside of a proper classroom, never held a real book in their small, work-roughened hands. What Susan hadn't known, what no one had bothered to tell her during the hiring process, was that the mines foreman, Kevin Diaz, had specifically requested a young, unmarried teacher for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with education and everything to do with his own twisted desires. Kevin Diaz was a man who took what he wanted without regard for law, morality, or human decency, and he had wanted Susan from the very moment she stepped off the supply wagon with her trunk of books and her head full of noble intentions. Tall and broad-shouldered, with cold blue eyes that seemed to strip away a person's dignity with a single glance, and a cruel mouth that spoke only in commands and threats, he ruled the mining camp with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove of false civility. The miners feared him with the bone-deep terror of men who knew their livelihoods depended on his whims. The few women in the settlement avoided him like they would a rabid wolf, and even the camp's owner, a distant businessman from San Francisco who cared only for profit margins and quarterly reports, gave him free rein to run operations as he saw fit. For the first month, Susan had managed to keep Diaz at bay through careful avoidance and the supposed protection of her small cabin near the schoolhouse. She threw herself into her work with the passionate dedication of a true believer, teaching the dozen children in the camp to read and write, finding solace in their eager faces and quick minds that reminded her why she had come west in the first place. The children loved her with the pure devotion that only the young can give, and their parents respected her dedication, her gentle way with their offspring. But none of them dared to openly oppose Diaz when he began making his intentions increasingly clear. The harassment had started small, almost innocuously. Diaz would find excuses to visit the schoolhouse during lessons, lingering after the children had gone home to help with chores, making casual comments about how lonely Susan must be in her little cabin, how a woman like her needed a man's protection in such a rough, dangerous place where accidents could happen to anyone at any time. Susan had rebuffed his advances politely at first, then more firmly as his behavior grew bolder and his suggestions more explicit. But her rejections only seemed to fuel his determination. She had written carefully worded letters to the mine's owner, documenting Diaz's inappropriate behavior and requesting immediate intervention. But somehow those letters never seemed to reach their destination, a fact that should have warned her about the true extent of Diaz's power and influence. As autumn gave way to the harsh mountain winter, Diaz's patience had worn dangerously thin. The mountain passes would soon be snowed in, trapping everyone in the camp until spring's thaw, and he knew that time was running out for his carefully laid plans. It was then that he made his move, arriving at Susan's cabin one bitter December night with two of his most loyal men, brutal, unthinking creatures who followed orders without question and asked no uncomfortable questions about their boss's methods. They had dragged her from her home while she slept, claiming she had been stealing from the company store, a charge everyone in the camp knew was absolutely false, but none dared dispute for fear of facing Diaz's wrath themselves. The next 3 months had been a living nightmare of captivity and systematic degradation designed to break her spirit completely. Diaz had kept her locked in a storage room behind the main office, a cramped, windowless space that reeked of coal dust and despair, bringing her out only when it suited his purposes or when he wanted to remind her of her helpless position. He had told the camp that she was being held pending trial for theft, that she would be taken to Denver for proper justice when the passes cleared in spring, a lie that everyone accepted because it was easier than confronting the truth. In reality, he had other plans for her. Plans that involved making her his unwilling wife once he had broken her spirit completely and reduced her to a state of absolute submission. Susan had endured his cruelties through sheer force of will, clinging to hope like a drowning woman clutches driftwood, telling herself that someone would come to help her, that the law would eventually reach even this remote place where civilization seemed to have forgotten its own rules. She had tried to escape twice during those dark months, only to be caught within hours and punished more severely each time, the beatings growing worse, the threats more explicit, the conditions of her captivity more degrading. By the 3rd month, her body bore the visible marks of Diaz's anger, bruises that never quite healed, cuts that left permanent scars, and her spirit had begun to crack under the constant pressure of fear and despair. It was during her final desperate escape attempt that she had met Jason Thompson, and that meeting had changed the course of both their lives forever. The mountain man had been hunting in the high country, tracking a wounded elk through the snow-covered peaks, when he heard the distant commotion of the search party. Susan had managed to slip her bonds during a supply run to the lower camp, taking advantage of a moment's inattention from her guards, but in her desperation to get away, she had chosen a treacherous path down a steep ravine rather than risk the more exposed main trail. The rocks had given way beneath her feet, sending her tumbling 30 feet down to a narrow ledge where she lay broken and barely conscious, her legs twisted at unnatural angles. Jason had found her there as the sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the snow crimson with its dying light, her dress torn and bloodied, her face pale as death itself. He was a man of few words, having lived alone in the mountains for the better part of 10 years, but something in Susan's battered face had stirred a protective instinct he thought long dead, buried with his dreams in the killing fields of the Civil War. Without hesitation, without stopping to consider the consequences, he had gathered her into his arms and carried her to his cabin, hidden deep in a valley that few men had ever seen and fewer still could find. The mountain man's cabin was a testament to self-sufficiency and quiet craftsmanship, built with the patient skill of a man who had nothing but time and the need to keep his hands busy. Constructed from massive logs and chinked with clay and moss, it sat in a small clearing beside a crystal-clear stream that sang day and night with the voice of the mountains. Inside, everything was neat and purposeful, from the hand-hewn furniture that showed the marks of careful planning to the shelves lined with preserved food and medical supplies that spoke of hard-won experience with isolation and self-reliance. Jason had learned to be his own doctor, blacksmith, and carpenter during his years of solitude, skills acquired through necessity and honed by practice. He had set Susan's legs with the skill of someone who had treated his own injuries many times over, someone who understood that in the wilderness, medical knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. The breaks were severe, the bones shattered in multiple places, but he worked with gentle precision, splinting and bandaging while she drifted in and out of consciousness, her fevered mumblings telling him more about her ordeal than any formal confession could have. When she finally awoke fully 3 days later, the first words out of her mouth had been an apology, a response so automatic it spoke volumes about what she had endured. "I'm sorry to be such a burden," she had whispered, tears streaming down her face as she realized the extent of her injuries and the impossibility of her situation. "I can't walk, sir. My legs are broken." Jason had been sitting beside her bed, whittling a piece of pine into a small bird with the patient skill of someone who had learned to find peace in simple tasks. He looked up at her words, his dark eyes serious but kind, weathered by years of solitude, but not hardened by them. "Then I'll carry you daily," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if promising to care for a broken stranger was just another part of mountain life. Those words had marked the beginning of an unusual partnership that would grow into something neither of them had expected. True to his promise, Jason had carried Susan wherever she needed to go, treating her not as a burden, but as a responsibility he had willingly accepted. He would lift her from the bed each morning, supporting her weight as if she were made of feathers, and help her to the chair by the window where she could watch the snow fall on the mountain peaks and feel the sun on her face. When she needed to tend to personal matters, he would carry her to the small alcove he had curtained off for privacy, always averting his eyes and speaking in gentle tones that reminded her that chivalry was not dead, even in the wilderness. As the days passed, Susan began to understand the man who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return. Jason Thompson had come to the mountains after the war, carrying wounds both visible and hidden, seeking solitude not from misanthropy, but from a bone-deep weariness with human conflict. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a Confederate saber that had nearly ended his life at Gettysburg, and his right hand bore the marks of shrapnel from an artillery shell that had killed half his regiment. But the deeper wounds were in his soul, carved there by the things he had seen and done during 4 years of brutal conflict that had tested every belief he held about human nature and divine justice. He had been a different man before the war, he told her during one of their quiet evening conversations. When the fire crackled in the hearth and the wind sang through the pines outside, he had owned a small farm in Missouri, had been engaged to a woman named Catherine whose laugh could light up a room, had plans for a family and a future built on the simple pleasures of working the land and watching children grow. The war had taken all of that away, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a bone-deep weariness that no amount of rest could cure. Catherine had married another man while he was away fighting, unable to wait for a soldier who might never return, and the farm had been sold to pay debts accumulated during his absence. Susan found herself sharing her own story in return, speaking of her childhood in Boston, where her father had been a professor and her mother a woman of gentle breeding who had filled their home with books and music and the belief that education could solve any problem. She told him about her parents' death from influenza, how she had nursed them both through their final illness, only to watch them slip away despite her best efforts, and how their deaths had prompted her decision to come west in search of purpose and meaning. She spoke of the children she had taught, their bright faces and eager questions, and how much she missed the simple joy of watching understanding dawn in their eyes when they grasped a new concept or mastered a difficult word. The mountain man proved to be surprisingly well educated, having attended a small college before the war interrupted his studies and changed the course of his life forever. He read voraciously, his cabin filled with books on everything from medicine to philosophy, volumes he had acquired through trade or purchase during his infrequent trips to civilization. He possessed a keen intelligence that had been honed by years of solitary contemplation, and his observations about life and human nature showed a depth of thought that surprised Susan with its sophistication. As Susan's legs slowly began to heal, their conversations grew longer and more intimate, touching on subjects that neither had discussed with another soul in years. It was during the third week of her recovery that they heard the first sounds of pursuit, the distant voices that shattered their peaceful isolation like a stone thrown through glass. Jason had been outside chopping wood for the evening fire when he noticed the sound of horses and voices echoing up from the valley below, faint but unmistakable. He had immediately come inside, his face grim with understanding, his movements taking on the purposeful efficiency of a man preparing for war. "They've found us," he said simply, beginning to gather supplies with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that survival often depended on quick thinking and rapid movement. Susan felt her heart sink as she realized what this meant, the implications hitting her like a physical blow. Diaz had not given up his search, had somehow tracked them to this remote sanctuary despite the snow in the distance. The thought of being dragged back to that storage room, of facing the mine foreman's rage at her escape, and the additional punishments he would devise, filled her with a terror that threatened to overwhelm her fragile composure. "I won't go back," she whispered, her hands clenching into fists despite the pain it caused in her healing bones. "I'd rather die than go back to him." Jason had knelt beside her Pierre, his large hands gentle as they covered hers, his touch warm and reassuring. "You won't go back," he said with quiet conviction, his voice carrying the weight of an oath sworn before God. "I give you my word on that." The next few hours had been a blur of preparation and desperate planning, as Jason drew upon years of military experience and wilderness survival to devise a strategy for their escape. He knew the mountains better than any man alive, knew every trail and hidden passage, every cave and secret valley that could provide shelter from pursuit. But Susan's condition complicated everything, turning what should have been a simple matter of disappearing into the wilderness into a complex logistical challenge. Her legs were far from healed, the bones still knitting together, and any significant movement caused her excruciating pain that threatened to render her unconscious. "They can't track us in the snow if we're careful," Jason had explained, as he fashioned a crude stretcher from pine poles and canvas, his hands working with the sure skill of someone who had improvised solutions to impossible problems many times before. "There's a place I know, a cave system that goes deep into the mountain. We can hide there until they give up the search." Susan had nodded, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel, knowing that Jason was risking everything for her, that he could simply disappear into the wilderness and leave her for Diaz to find. The fact that he chose to stay, to fight for her freedom at the cost of his own safety, filled her with a gratitude so profound that it took her breath away and made her wonder what she had done to deserve such loyalty from a man who barely knew her. The journey to the cave had been a nightmare of pain and endurance that tested both their physical limits and their determination to remain free. Jason had pulled the stretcher himself, navigating treacherous slopes and narrow ledges with the sure-footed grace of a mountain goat, his breath coming in white puffs in the frigid air. Susan had bitten down on a leather strap to keep from crying out, knowing that any sound might give away their position to the men hunting them. Tasting blood where her teeth cut through the tough hide, they had reached the cave system just as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and crimson, the entrance hidden behind a curtain of icicles and snow-laden pine boughs that made it invisible to casual observation. Jason had carried her inside, his breathing only slightly labored despite the grueling climb, and settled her on a bed of pine needles and fur robes that he had obviously prepared in advance, another example of his careful planning and foresight. "This is one of several places I've stocked over the years," he explained, as he lit a small fire in a natural chimney that would disperse the smoke invisibly among the rocks above, his movements economical and sure. "I learned during the war that it pays to have bolt holes prepared, places where a man can disappear when the world gets too dangerous." The cave was surprisingly comfortable, carved by centuries of water flow into a series of connected chambers that provided both shelter and security. Jason had stored supplies here over the years, including food, blankets, medical supplies, and even a few books for those long nights when sleep refused to come. As they settled in for what might be a long wait, Susan found herself marveling at the man's foresight and preparation, the way he had turned survival into an art form. That first night in the cave, as the wind howled outside and the fire cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, Susan and Jason had talked until dawn, their conversation ranging over topics both profound and mundane. She learned that he had been tracking Diaz's activities for months, had heard rumors of the mine foreman's cruelties and excesses from traders and trappers who passed through the high country. He had been planning to investigate when he found her broken at the bottom of the ravine, a discovery that had transformed his vague concerns into a personal mission. There are stories about that place, Jason had said, his voice heavy with disgust and barely controlled anger. Stories about women who went up there and were never seen again. The law doesn't reach that high into the mountains. And men like Diaz know it. They think they can do whatever they want without consequences. Susan had shuddered at the implications, thinking of the other women who might have suffered fates worse than her own. Young girls, perhaps, who had been even less equipped to resist Diaz's predations. The realization that she had been just one of many victims filled her with a cold rage that surprised her with its intensity, a fury that burned like ice in her veins. They had spent 3 days in the cave before the search party found their trail, 3 days of growing intimacy and deepening understanding. Jason had gone out at dawn to check their surroundings and had returned with grim news written in every line of his weathered face. The men were close, perhaps only hours behind, and they had brought tracking dogs whose keen noses could follow a trail days old. "We need to move," he said as he began packing their supplies with swift efficiency. "There's another way out of these caves, but it's dangerous. The passage is narrow. And there's a drop on the other side that I'll have to lower you down with ropes." Susan had nodded, understanding that they had no choice in the matter. The alternative was capture, and that was unthinkable. As Jason prepared the ropes and checked their gear, she found herself studying his face in the firelight, noting the way concentration furrowed his brow and determination set his jaw. Somewhere during their time together, her feelings for this quiet, gentle man had grown beyond gratitude into something deeper and more complex, something that made her heart race when he looked at her with those dark, serious eyes. He was not handsome in the conventional sense, his features too rough and weathered for that, marked by years of harsh weather and harder experiences. But there was a strength in him that went beyond the physical. He possessed a quiet integrity that shone through every action, a fundamental decency that had somehow survived the horrors of war and the isolation of the wilderness. When he looked at her, she saw not pity or desire, but a genuine respect that no one had ever shown her before, a recognition of her worth as a human being that made her feel valued in a way she had never experienced. The escape through the back of the cave system had tested both their courage and Jason's mountaineering skills to their absolute limits. The passage was barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, a natural tunnel carved through solid rock that seemed to go on forever in the darkness. It opened onto a sheer cliff face that dropped 200 feet to a narrow valley below, a vista so terrifying that Susan's breath caught in her throat when she first saw it. Jason had anchored his ropes to solid stone and lowered Susan first, his strong arms controlling her descent with careful precision, his voice calling down encouragement as she spun slowly in the void. The drop had been terrifying, every foot of the descent a test of faith in Jason's skill and the strength of his ropes. Susan had forced herself to trust completely, knowing that doubt would only make the experience worse. And when she finally reached the bottom, battered but safe, she had looked up to see him rappelling down with their supplies, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had done such things many times before and lived to tell about it. They had made good time through the valley, Jason carrying Susan when the terrain became too difficult for the stretcher, his endurance seemingly limitless. But their pursuers were persistent, driven by Diaz's fury and the promise of reward, and by midday they could hear the distant baying of hounds echoing off the canyon walls like the voices of demons. It was then that Jason had made a decision that would change everything, a choice that revealed the true depth of his character. "I'm going to lead them away," he said as he settled Susan against the base of a large pine tree, his face calm, but his eyes showing the strain of their ordeal. "There's an old mining trail that leads up to the ridge. I'll take it and leave a clear trail for them to follow. You stay here and rest." Susan had grabbed his arm with surprising strength, her eyes wide with fear at the thought of being abandoned. "Don't leave me," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Please, I can't bear to be alone again." Jason had knelt beside her, his face gentle but determined, his hand warm against her cheek. "I'm not leaving you," he said softly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "I'm buying us time. There's a place up ahead, an old trapper's cabin. I'll lead them away from here, then circle back and meet you there." "But what if they catch you?" Susan asked, the thought of losing him now almost unbearable after everything they had shared. "They won't," Jason replied with quiet confidence, his smile reassuring despite the danger they faced. "I know these mountains better than they ever will." That had been 6 hours ago, and now Susan sat alone in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of pursuit growing ever closer, while fear gnawed at her heart like a living thing. Jason had not returned, and she was beginning to fear the worst, imagining him captured or killed while trying to protect her. Her legs throbbed with constant pain, and exhaustion weighed on her like a physical burden, but she knew she could not give up now. Too much depended on her survival, not just her own freedom, but the promise of justice for all the women who had suffered at Diaz's hands. The sound of breaking branches nearby made her freeze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Through the trees, she could see the flicker of torches, hear the rough voices of the men who had been hunting her for days, their crude jokes and casual threats carrying clearly in the still mountain air. They were close now, perhaps only a few hundred yards away, and she realized with growing despair that they would find her soon unless a miracle occurred. It was then that she heard the soft whistle, 3 low notes that Jason had taught her as a signal, a sound so perfectly imitated that it might have been a real bird if she hadn't known better. Relief flooded through her as she saw his familiar silhouette moving through the trees, his face grim but determined, his movements showing the effects of his ordeal, but his spirit unbroken. "They're right behind me," he said, quietly as he lifted her into his arms, his breathing slightly labored, but his grip as strong as ever. "We need to move now." Susan wrapped her arms around his neck, feeling the solid strength of his shoulders, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek. Despite everything they had endured, despite the danger that surrounded them like a pack of wolves, she felt safe in his arms. It was a feeling she had never experienced before. This complete trust in another person's strength and commitment. This absolute faith that he would keep his word no matter what the case. Jason carried her swiftly through the forest, his feet finding purchase on surfaces that would have challenged a mountain goat, his knowledge of the terrain allowing him to navigate obstacles that would have stopped most men cold. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder as their hunters realized they were on the right trail, voices shouting commands, dog barking with excitement, and the crash of men forcing their way through the underbrush echoed through the night like the approach of an army. The old trapper's cabin appeared ahead of them, a squat log structure that had been abandoned for decades, its roof partially collapsed and its walls weathered gray by countless seasons. Jason kicked open the door and carried Susan inside, setting her down gently on a crude wooden bunk that creaked under her weight. The cabin was small and dirty, filled with the musty smell of abandonment, but it offered shelter from the wind in a defensible position if it came to a fight. "How many are there?" Susan asked as Jason checked his rifle and pistol with the practiced efficiency of a veteran soldier. "6 men and 2 dogs, Jason replied grimly, his face set in hard lines. "Diaz is with them, along with some hired guns from Denver." "They mean business this time." Susan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air as she absorbed this information. She knew Diaz well enough to understand that he would not give up easily, that he saw her escape as a personal affront that demanded retribution at any cost. The mine foreman was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and he had the resources to hire whatever help he needed to settle old scores. "What are we going to do?" she asked, trying to keep the fear out of her voice while her mind raced through the limited options available to them. Jason was silent for a long moment, his face thoughtful as he considered their situation with the cold calculation of a military tactician. The cabin had only one door and 2 small windows, making it both a fortress and a trap depending on how the situation developed. They had enough ammunition for a sustained fight, but they were outnumbered 3-1, and Susan's condition made escape virtually impossible. "I'm going to give you a choice," he said finally, his voice heavy with emotion and the weight of impossible decisions. I can try to hold them off here while you hide in the root cellar. There's a chance they won't find you, and you might be able to slip away after they're gone. Right. And the other choice? Susan asked, though she thought she already knew what he would say. We face them together, Jason said simply, his eyes meeting hers with complete honesty. I won't lie to you about the odds. We're outnumbered and outgunned, and your legs make it impossible for us to run. But sometimes a man has to make a stand, regardless of the consequences. Susan looked into his eyes and saw the truth there. The absolute certainty that he was prepared to die for her, this man who had known her for less than a month, who owed her nothing but had given her everything. The realization filled her with a fierce determination that surprised her with its intensity, a resolve that burned away her fear and left only cold purpose in its wake. We face them together, she said firmly, her voice stronger than it had been in months, carrying a conviction that made Jason's eyes widen with a surprise and admiration. I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid. If this is where we make our stand, then so be it. Jason nodded slowly, a smile touching the corners of his mouth despite the gravity of their situation. In that moment, Susan saw not the weathered mountain man, but the young soldier he had once been, the idealistic boy who had marched off to war with dreams of glory and honor. The years had carved lines of pain and loss into his face, had tested him in ways that would have broken lesser men, but they had not destroyed the fundamental courage that lay at his core like bedrock beneath shifting soil. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their moment of connection, the thunder of hoofbeats on frozen ground announcing that their time for preparation was nearly over. Through the cabin's grimy windows, they could see torches moving through the trees, hear the excited baying of the tracking dogs as they caught the scent of their quarry. Diaz and his men had found them at last, and there would be no more running, no more hiding in caves and forgotten places. Jason positioned himself at the window facing the main approach, his rifle ready, his movements economical and sure. Susan took the pistol he offered her, checking the cylinder with hands that were steadier than she had expected, her fingers remembering the lessons he had taught her during their time in the cave. She might not be able to walk, but she could still fight, and the thought filled her with a grim satisfaction that surprised her with its intensity. The first voice that called out through the darkness was Kevin Diaz himself, his tone mocking and confident, filled with the arrogance of a man who believed he held all the cards. Come out, little school teacher, he shouted, his words carrying clearly in the still air. You've led us quite a chase, but it's over now. Come out peaceful-like, and maybe I'll go easy on your mountain man friend. Susan felt her jaw clench with anger at the familiar sound of his voice, memories flooding back of the 3 months she had spent as his prisoner, forced to listen to his threats and promises, his crude descriptions of what he planned to do to her once he had broken her will completely. Now, with a weapon in her hands and Jason beside her, she felt a courage she had never known she possessed, a strength that came not from desperation, but from righteous anger. Go to hell, Diaz, she called back, her voice carrying clearly through the night air, each word carefully chosen to convey her absolute defiance. I'd rather die than go back with you. A harsh laugh answered her defiance, the sound echoing off the surrounding trees. Oh, you'll come back, he replied, his voice filled with cruel amusement. One way or another, you'll come back. Boys, light up that cabin. Let's smoke them out like rats from a granary. The first torch landed on the roof with a shower of sparks, followed quickly by 2 more, the dry wood catching fire immediately and filling the cabin with the acrid smell of smoke and the ominous crackle of flames. Jason cursed under his breath as he realized their situation had just become desperate, the fire eliminating any possibility of a prolonged siege. They're trying to burn us out, he said, his voice calm despite the circumstances, his military training taking over as he assessed their rapidly deteriorating position. We'll have to make a break for it. Susan nodded, understanding that they had no choice in the matter. The cabin was already filling with smoke, and the fire was spreading quickly across the ancient timbers, turning their refuge into a death trap. To stay would mean death by fire or smoke inhalation, but to leave would mean facing Diaz and his men in the open, where their superior numbers would tell. When I give the word, Jason said, checking his weapons one final time, his movements precise and economical. "I'm going to kick open that door and start shooting. I'll try to clear a path to the trees. Can you hold on if I carry you?" Susan gripped the pistol tighter, feeling its weight and balance, the cold metal warming under her touch. "I'll hold on," she said firmly, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "And I'll shoot anyone who tries to stop us." Jason looked at her with something approaching admiration, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames that were rapidly consuming their shelter. In the flickering light of the growing fire, she looked nothing like the broken woman he had found at the bottom of the ravine. Her face was set with determination, her eyes bright with courage, and despite her physical limitations, she radiated a strength that took his breath away and made him proud to stand beside her. "Ready?" he asked, positioning himself beside the door, his body coiled like a spring ready to release. Susan nodded, wrapping her free arm around his neck as he lifted her from the bunk, her weight seeming to disappear in the surge of adrenaline that preceded battle. The smoke was getting thicker now, making it hard to breathe, and the heat from the flames was becoming unbearable, turning the air itself into an enemy. Through the windows, they could see the dark shapes of Diaz's men positioned around the clearing, waiting for them to emerge like spiders, waiting for flies to stumble into their web. "Now," Jason said, and kicked the door open with explosive force, the sound echoing through the night like a gunshot. The night erupted into chaos as Jason burst from the burning cabin with Susan in his arms, his rifle barking twice in rapid succession like an extension of his will. Two of Diaz's men went down before they could react, their surprise cries cut short by bullets that found their mark with deadly precision. Susan added her own fire to the mix, her pistol cracking as she aimed at the muzzle flashes in the darkness, her shots going wide but close enough to force their enemies to take cover. Jason ran with the fluid grace of a man born to the mountains, his feet finding purchase on the uneven ground, despite the burden he carried in the chaos surrounding them. Bullets whined through the air around them like angry hornets, splintering bark from the trees and sending up spurts of dirt from the forest floor. Behind them, the cabin was now fully engulfed in flames, casting dancing shadows that made it difficult for their pursuers to aim accurately while providing a hellish backdrop to their desperate flight. They made it to the tree line before the first of the tracking dogs reaching them, the animal launching itself at Jason's back with slavering jaws and murder in its eyes. The beast's teeth sought his throat, but Susan's pistol spoke again, and the dog dropped with a yelp of pain, its body hitting the ground with a heavy thud. The second dog was close behind, its eyes reflecting the firelight like twin coals, but Jason's rifle took care of it with a single well-placed shot that echoed through the forest. "Keep moving," Jason shouted over the din of gunfire and shouting voices, his breath coming hard from the exertion, but his pace never faltering. "There's a gorge about a quarter-mile ahead. If we can reach it, we might have a chance." Susan reloaded her pistol with practiced efficiency, her hands steady despite the jolting motion of Jason's run and the adrenaline coursing through her veins like liquid fire. She had never fired a weapon in anger before tonight, but desperation and determination had made her deadly accurate, each shot carefully aimed and purposeful. The thought of being taken alive by Diaz gave her a courage that bordered on recklessness, a willingness to face any danger rather than return to captivity. Behind them, Kevin Diaz's voice rose above the chaos, screaming orders at his remaining men with the fury of a man whose carefully laid plans were crumbling around him. The mine foreman was furious at the resistance they had encountered, enraged that his quarry had dared to fight back with such effectiveness. He had expected to find a broken woman and perhaps an old hermit, not two people willing to kill with cold efficiency to maintain their freedom. Jason's knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable as he led them through the darkness, his intimate familiarity with every rock and root, every fallen log and hidden stream, allowing him to navigate obstacles that would have stopped most men cold. What would have been an impossible journey for most people became merely difficult under his guidance, though the constant threat of pursuit made every step a race against death and the growing certainty that their luck could not hold forever. The gorge appeared ahead of them like a wound in the earth, a dark gash in the mountainside that dropped away into nothingness, its depths hidden by shadows that seemed to swallow light itself. Jason paused at its edge, breathing hard from the sustained effort of carrying a Susan while dodging bullets and returning fire, his chest heaving as he assessed their options. The chasm was perhaps 20 feet wide, with a rope bridge spanning its depths that looked as if it had been there since the beginning of time, its ancient hemp-weathered gray by countless seasons. "That bridge won't hold both of us," Susan said, understanding immediately what Jason was thinking, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won experience with the realities of their situation. "It'll hold," Jason replied with more confidence than he felt, his jaw set with determination. "It has to." The sound of pursuit was getting closer now, crashing through the underbrush with the determination of men who knew their quarry was trapped and had nowhere left to run. Jason stepped onto the rope bridge, feeling it sway alarmingly under their combined weight, the ancient hemp creaking and groaning with each step like the voice of the mountain itself. The planking was all rotten in places, and Susan could hear individual strands beginning to snap under the strain, each breaking fiber bringing them closer to disaster. Halfway across, disaster struck with the suddenness of lightning. One of Diaz's men appeared at the edge of the gorge behind them, his rifle aimed at Jason's back with deadly intent, his face twisted with concentration as he lined up his shot. Susan saw him first and twisted in Jason's arms, her pistol coming up instinctively, her training taking over without conscious thought. Her shot took the man in the chest, sending him tumbling into the darkness below, with a scream that echoed off the canyon walls, but the motion had thrown Jason off balance. The mountain man stumbled, his foot slipping through a gap in the rope planking, the rotten wood giving way beneath his weight. For a terrifying moment, they teetered on the edge of disaster, the bridge swaying wildly as Jason fought to regain his footing while maintaining his grip on both Susan and the bridge supports. Susan felt the void yawning beneath them, felt the ropes stretching and beginning to give way under their combined weight, the ancient fibers finally reaching their breaking point. "Hold on," Jason gasped, his powerful arms straining to maintain his grip as the bridge bucked and twisted beneath them like a living thing. "Just hold on." But it was too late. With a sound like a gunshot, the main support rope parted, sending them both tumbling toward the rocky bottom of the gorge. Susan's scream echoing off the canyon walls as they fell through the darkness toward what seemed like certain death. They hit the water with tremendous force, the icy mountain stream that ran along the bottom of the gorge, cushioning their fall just enough to save their lives, but not enough to prevent serious injury. Jason's body absorbed most of the impact, and Susan felt something give way in his chest as they went under, the sound of breaking ribs audible even underwater. The current was swift and treacherous, filled with hidden rocks and fallen trees that could crush an unwary swimmer in seconds, turning rescue into another form of death. Susan fought to keep Jason's head above water as the stream carried them downstream, his blood streaming from a gash on his forehead and mixing with the icy water that threatened to numb them both into unconsciousness. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored, his face pale as death in the moonlight that filtered down through the canyon walls. Her own legs screamed with agony from the impact, but she ignored the pain and focused on keeping them both alive, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. The stream widened into a small pool where the current slowed enough for Susan to drag Jason to shore, her strength nearly exhausted by the effort of fighting the current while supporting his dead weight. She pulled him onto a narrow beach of sand and pebbles, her muscles screaming with fatigue, her lungs burning from the cold water and thin mountain air. Above them, she could hear Diaz and his men shouting at the edge of the gorge, but the darkness and the distance made it impossible for them to see what had happened to their quarry. Jason's eyes fluttered open as Susan checked him for injuries, his consciousness returning slowly, like a man waking from a deep dream. His breathing was ragged, and she could see that several of his ribs were broken, but he was alive, and that was all that mattered in this moment. More importantly, he was conscious and aware of their situation, his mind clear despite the pain that must be coursing through his body. "Did we make it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of running water and the distant voices of their pursuers. "We're alive," Susan replied, tears streaming down her face as relief flooded through her like warm honey. "That's what matters." Jason tried to sit up and immediately gasped with pain, his face contorting as broken ribs shifted and ground against each other. His face was pale in the moonlight, and Susan could see that he was badly hurt, the fall that had saved them from Diaz having also robbed Jason of his strength and mobility. leaving him as helpless as she had been when he first found her. "Mom, looks like the tables have turned," he said with a weak smile, his sense of humor intact despite their desperate situation. "Now you'll have to carry me." Susan looked at her broken legs, then at Jason's battered body, and began to laugh despite everything. The sound edged with hysteria, but containing genuine mirth as well. It was a sound that spoke of the absurdity of their situation, the dark humor that sometimes emerges in moments of extreme crisis. Here they were, two broken people at the bottom of a gorge, with their enemies somewhere above and no clear way out, and Jason was making jokes about their reversed roles. "We're quite a pair," she said, wiping her eyes as her laughter subsided into something more manageable. Two cripples against the world." The sound of voices from above reminded them that their situation was far from resolved, that Diaz and his men were looking for a way down into the gorge and would eventually find one. Susan and Jason needed to move, but neither of them was capable of walking more than a few steps without assistance, and their combined injuries made any kind of rapid movement virtually impossible. "There's a cave system along this stream," Jason said, his voice growing stronger as he fought through the pain and forced his mind to focus on survival. "About 100 yards downstream. If we can reach it, we can hide until they give up the search." Susan looked at the distance he indicated and felt her heart sink as she realized the magnitude of the task before them. 100 yards might as well have been 100 miles given their condition, but the alternative was capture and certain death, so there really was no choice in the matter. She fashioned a crude travois from driftwood and torn fabric, using skills she had never known she possessed, but which seemed to come naturally in this moment of crisis. Then began the agonizing process of moving Jason onto it, every movement sending waves of pain through both their bodies as broken bones shifted and protested. When she finally began pulling him downstream, Susan felt as if her arms would tear from their sockets, but she persevered through sheer determination. The journey to the cave took nearly 2 hours, with frequent stops to rest and listen for sounds of pursuit, each pause a test of their resolve and endurance. Susan's hands were raw and bleeding by the time they reached their destination, the rough rope cutting through her skin like a knife, but she had managed to get Jason to safety. The cave entrance was hidden behind a curtain of hanging moss and ferns, invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look, another of Jason's carefully prepared refuges. Inside, the cave was dry and spacious, carved from solid rock by centuries of water flow, its walls smooth and cool to the touch. Jason directed Susan to a cache of supplies he had hidden there years before, another of his prepared bolt holes that might now save their lives. There were blankets, food, medical supplies, and even a small oil lamp that cast a warm glow over the stone walls when she managed to light it with trembling fingers. As Susan tended to Jason's injuries, binding his ribs and cleaning the cut on his forehead with water from their medical supplies, she marveled at the change that had come over her during their ordeal. 3 months ago, she had been a helpless victim, broken in body and spirit by Kevin Diaz's systematic cruelty, unable to defend herself or even conceive of fighting back. Now, despite her physical limitations, she felt stronger than she ever had in her life, more capable and confident than she had thought possible. The realization came to her gradually as she worked over Jason's battered form, her hands steady and sure despite the magnitude of their situation. She was no longer the frightened schoolteacher who had been dragged from her cabin in the night, helpless and defenseless against forces beyond her control. The woman who had fought her way out of that burning cabin, who had killed to protect the man she loved, who had dragged him to safety despite her own injuries and the seemingly impossible odds against them, was someone entirely different, someone stronger, braver, more capable than she had ever imagined herself to be, forged in the crucible of adversity into something new and powerful. Jason watched her work with growing admiration, his eyes following her movements as she cleaned his wounds and applied fresh bandages with the skill of a trained nurse. Despite everything she had endured, despite the pain she must be feeling from her own injuries, Susan's hands were steady and sure as she tended to his needs, her face calm and focused despite the chaos of their recent escape. There was a quiet competence about her now, a strength that went far beyond the physical and spoke to something fundamental in her character. You've changed, he said softly as she finished wrapping his ribs, his voice carrying a note of wonder and respect. Susan paused in her work, considering his words with the seriousness they deserved. Have I, she asked, her voice thoughtful as she examined her own transformation. Or have I just finally become who I was always meant to be? Jason smiled despite the pain in his chest, his eyes warm with affection and admiration. Maybe both, he replied, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. Maybe it took all this to show you what you're truly capable of. They spent the next 3 days in the cave, recovering their strength and waiting for the search to move on. Their time together deepening their understanding of each other and themselves. Jason's injuries were serious but not life-threatening, and Susan's legs were finally beginning to show signs of real healing, the bones knitting together properly at last. More importantly, they had found something in each other that neither had expected to discover when this ordeal began, a connection that transcended their circumstances and spoke to something deeper and more permanent. Their conversations during those quiet hours revealed depths of character and compatibility that surprised them both, layers of personality and experience that had been hidden beneath the surface of their desperate circumstances. Jason spoke of his dreams for the future, plans that had been buried under years of solitude and self-imposed exile, but which now seemed possible again with the right partner. Susan shared her own hopes and aspirations, goals that had seemed impossible during her months of captivity, but now felt within reach once again, achievable with the support of someone who truly understood her. On the fourth morning, Jason felt strong enough to venture outside and check their surroundings, his ribs still painful but no longer preventing him from moving with reasonable freedom. He returned with news that brought both relief and a strange sense of anticlimax, the kind of emotional letdown that often follows periods of intense danger. Their pursuers had finally given up the search, convinced that their quarry had died in the fall from the bridge, the bodies swept away by the swift current to places where they would never be found. We're free, Jason said as he settled beside Susan in their makeshift camp, his voice carrying a note of wonder as if he couldn't quite believe it himself. They think we're dead, which means we can start over somewhere else, build a new life without fear of the past catching up with us. Susan felt a surge of joy at his words, a happiness so profound it brought tears to her eyes, but it was tempered by the knowledge of what that freedom had cost them both. They were alive, but they were also forever changed by their ordeal, marked by experiences that would shape the rest of their lives. The innocence they had both possessed before their meeting was gone, replaced by a hard-won wisdom and strength that came at a price neither had expected to pay. Where will we go? She asked. Though she realized that the destination mattered less than the company, that home was not a place, but a person. There's a valley about 50 miles south of here, Jason replied, his voice taking on a dreamy quality as he described his vision. Good water, fertile soil, far enough from civilization to be safe but close enough to trade for supplies when we need them. I've thought about settling there for years, but I never had a reason to before. And now you do? Susan asked, though she thought she knew the answer, could see it in his eyes. Now I do, Jason confirmed, his hand finding hers in the lamplight, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that spoke of permanence and commitment. If you'll have me, that is. A broken-down mountain man isn't much of a catch for a lady like you. Susan laughed, the sound echoing off the cave walls and filling the space with warmth and joy. A lady like me? She said with mock indignation, her eyes sparkling with mirth. I'm a wanted woman, remember? An escaped prisoner with a price on her head. I think we're well matched in that regard. The journey to Jason's Valley took them 2 weeks, traveling slowly to accommodate their injuries and taking care to avoid any settlements where they might be recognized by someone who had heard the stories. Jason had fashioned a proper stretcher for Susan, but as her legs continued to heal under his careful ministrations, she was able to walk short distances with the aid of crutches he carved from mountain ash, each step a small victory in her recovery. The valley, when they finally reached it after their long and difficult journey, was everything Jason had promised and more, a hidden paradise that seemed designed by nature itself as a refuge for those seeking peace and solitude. Nestled between towering peaks that stood like sentinels against the sky and fed by a crystal-clear stream that sang day and night with the voice of the mountains, It was a place untouched by the outside world, where time seemed to move at its own pace, and the troubles of civilization felt like distant memories. Wild flowers carpeted the meadows in brilliant profusion, their colors so vivid they seemed painted by an artist's brush, and deer grazed peacefully in the morning mist, unafraid of human presence. The air was so clean and pure that it seemed to wash away the memories of their recent ordeal with each breath, replacing them with hope and the promise of a new beginning. It was a place where healing could happen, where two broken people could rebuild their lives and discover what happiness might look like. Jason had been planning this settlement for years, and his preparations showed in every detail of their new home. He had cached building supplies in several locations throughout the valley, had surveyed the best spots for a cabin and barn with the eye of an experienced frontiersman, and had even begun clearing some of the land for farming during his previous visits. With Susan's help and encouragement, the work progressed rapidly, their shared labor creating not just shelter, but a sense of partnership and common purpose. By autumn, they had completed a snug cabin that would see them through the winter, along with a small barn for the livestock Jason planned to acquire in the spring. The cabin was a testament to their combined skills and determination, its walls straight and true, its roof tight against the weather, its interior warm and welcoming. Susan had planted a garden that produced enough vegetables to supplement their diet of game and fish, and she had even managed to establish a small school for the few children in the scattered homesteads nearby, her teaching skills finding new purpose in this remote setting. Their relationship had deepened and matured during the months of shared labor and common purpose, growing from mutual dependence into something richer and more complex. What had begun as a partnership born of necessity had evolved into genuine love, a bond forged in adversity and tempered by shared hardship that felt stronger than anything either had experienced before. They had learned to read each other's moods and needs, to work together with the smooth efficiency of a team that had been together for years rather than months. When Jason finally asked Susan to marry him on a crisp October evening, as they watched the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, her answer was never in doubt. They had already committed their lives to each other in every way that mattered, had already proven their love through actions rather than words, and the formal ceremony would simply acknowledge what had already become reality. The wedding was a simple affair, performed by a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through the valley on his circuit, a kindly old man who asked no uncomfortable questions about their past and seemed genuinely pleased to unite two people so obviously devoted to each other. Their only witnesses were the handful of neighbors who had become their friends, hardy mountain folk who judged people by their present actions rather than their past mistakes, and who had come to respect both Jason and Susan for their integrity and generosity. Susan wore a simple dress of blue wool that she had sewn herself, its lines clean and elegant despite the humble materials, and Jason had traded for a gold ring from a prospector heading back to civilization, the metal bright and untarnished as the love it represented. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, the words carrying extra weight because of everything they had endured to reach this moment of joy and commitment. Winter came early that year, sealing them into their valley with walls of snow and ice that made travel impossible but also ensured their privacy and security. But far from feeling trapped, Susan and Jason found the isolation peaceful and restorative, a chance to focus on each other and their new life together without the distractions and pressures of the outside world. They spent the long evenings reading by the fire, planning improvements for the coming year, and simply enjoying each other's company in the quiet contentment of true partnership. Susan's legs had healed completely, though she would always walk with a slight limp that served as a reminder of how far she had come, and Jason's ribs had mended stronger than before, the breaks leaving no lasting weakness. More importantly, the emotional wounds they had both carried were beginning to heal as well, replaced by the confidence that came from having survived their worst fears and emerged victorious. Spring brought new challenges and opportunities that tested their skills and determination in different ways. Jason acquired a small herd of cattle and began the work of turning their valley into a proper ranch, his experience with horses and livestock serving him well in this new endeavor. Susan expanded her school, welcoming children from homesteads as far as 20 miles away, and began teaching some of the adults as well, her reputation as an educator spreading throughout the region. Their reputation for fairness and competence spread throughout the scattered communities of the high country, and they found themselves becoming unofficial leaders of their small but growing community. People came to them for advice on everything from crop rotation to settling disputes, trusting their judgment and valuing their opinions. It was a responsibility they accepted gladly, understanding that leadership was simply another form of service. It was during their second summer in the valley that they received unexpected news from the outside world that would finally close the book on their past. A federal marshal arrived one day with word that Kevin Diaz had finally been arrested for his crimes, brought down by an investigation that had started with Susan's escape and grown to encompass years of corruption and abuse. It seemed that her courage in escaping and surviving had been the beginning of his downfall, as other victims had finally found the courage to come forward with their own stories of abuse and corruption. The marshal, a weathered man named Timothy Nguyen, who had spent years tracking down men like Diaz, had tracked them down not to arrest them, but to thank them and to bring news of justice finally served. Susan's courage in escaping and surviving had provided the catalyst that brought Diaz to justice, and her testimony, given in the safety of their valley home, had been crucial in securing his conviction and ensuring that he would never hurt another woman. He's been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, Marshal Nguyen told them as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set behind the peaks. And the mine's been shut down, pending a full investigation. You folks did more than save yourselves. You saved a lot of other people, too. As they watched the marshal ride away, disappearing into the gathering dusk like a figure from a dream, Susan felt a sense of closure that she had not expected. The nightmare of her captivity was finally over, not just for her, but for all the other women who might have suffered at Diaz's hands. Justice had been served, and she and Jason were free to build their future without fear of the past catching up with them. Years passed in peaceful contentment, each season bringing its own challenges and rewards as they built their life together in their hidden valley. Their ranch prospered under Jason's careful management. Their school grew under Susan's dedicated teaching, and their love deepened with each passing season like wine aging in the cellar. Susan gave birth to 3 children over the years, 2 boys and a girl, who grew up strong and healthy in the clean mountain air, their laughter filling the valley with fun and their curiosity keeping both parents on their toes. Jason proved to be a devoted father, teaching his sons the skills they would need to survive in the wilderness, while encouraging his daughter's love of learning and books. He showed them how to track animals and read weather signs, how to fish the mountain streams and hunt the high country, but he also made sure they understood the value of education and the importance of treating all people with respect and dignity. The children knew nothing of their parents' dark past, seeing only the love and stability that surrounded them like a warm blanket. Susan had become the heart of their small community, her school producing young people who went on to make their mark in the wider world, carrying with them the values and knowledge she had instilled. Jason had earned a reputation as a fair and honest rancher, and his advice was sought by neighbors facing difficult decisions, his wisdom valued by all who knew him. On quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the day's work was done, Susan and Jason would sometimes talk about their journey from that terrible night in the burning cabin to the peace and happiness they had found. They never spoke of it with regret, understanding that their trials had been necessary to forge them into the people they had become, that without the darkness, they might never have appreciated the light. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that day, Susan said one night, as they sat watching the stars emerge over their valley, the Milky Way spreading across the sky like a river of light. Jason considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked it, his face thoughtful in the starlight. I think we would have found each other eventually, he replied with quiet conviction. Some things are just meant to be. Susan smiled at his certainty, remembering the broken woman she had been and marveling at the strength she had discovered within herself. Her legs might have been shattered in that fall down the ravine, but her spirit had emerged stronger than ever, tempered by adversity into something unbreakable. Jason's promise to carry her daily had been kept in ways neither of them had imagined, just as she had learned to carry him through the dark moments when his own strength faltered. Their story became a legend in the mountains, told around campfires and in frontier saloons, as an example of what 2 people could accomplish when they refused to give up. when they chose love over fear and hope over despair. But for Susan and Jason, it was simply their life, built one day at a time on a foundation of mutual respect, shared hardship, and enduring love that had proven stronger than any obstacle. As the years turned into decades, their valley filled with the sounds of grandchildren's laughter and the quiet contentment of a life well lived. Susan's hair turned silver like moonlight on snow, and Jason's face became even more weathered by sun and wind. But their love remained as strong as the mountains that surrounded them, as constant as the stream that sang through their valley. When visitors asked about the secret of their happiness, Susan would always give the same answer, her voice carrying the wisdom of hard-won experience. "We learn that true strength comes not from what we can do alone," she would say, her eyes meeting Jason's across the room, "but from what we can accomplish together." Sometimes the greatest journeys begin with the simple promise to carry each other through whatever comes. And in their hidden valley, surrounded by the peaks that had witnessed their transformation from broken victims to triumphant survivors, Susan and Jason Thompson continued to keep that promise, day after day, year after year, until the end of their days. Their love had been forged in fire and tempered by adversity, creating something stronger and more beautiful than either had thought possible. In learning to carry each other, they had discovered the true meaning of strength, and in that discovery, they had found their way home to a place where love could flourish and two hearts could beat as one for all eternity.